But let's begin with Pugin. And let's read a little bit what was written by Rosemary Hill in The Guardian. Um, the title of the article is Pugin, God's Architect. So Augustus, he has two other names, which I didn't memorize. Pugin's book, Contrasts, written in 1836, was the first architectural manifesto and had a profound influence on the next three generations of urban designers. Well, when urban designers, architects and designers and so on. So Pugin was born in London on March 1st, 1812. So that's 210 years ago, was only 24 when he published Contrasts. It was the book that made his name and was the first architectural manifesto. So this is very interesting that apparently the first architectural manifesto was actually a manifesto not for man in a way, but for God, and you'll understand why. Sorry, there are these advertisings here. I'm trying to eliminate them. So prior to that, there had been treatises on building going back to Vitruvius, texts that set out rules for proportion, aesthetics, and construction. Contrasts, as its many critics were quick to point out, had little to say on these subjects. What Pugin offered his readers instead was an entire social program, one which redefined architecture as a moral force imbued with political and religious meaning. Published on the eve of the Victorian age, Pugin's polemic was an early rehearsal of a theme that was to echo through the 19th century and return to haunt the 21st century. The problems of the modern city. In 1836, the year of the book's publication, the question was still new. Men and women had never lived together in such vast numbers before, and as industry developed and drew more workers from the country to the towns, so the mills and factories, warehouses, workhouses, and slum terraces spread. 10 years earlier, the Prussian architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel in Britain to carry out some discreet industrial espionage, I didn't know about this, had been horrified by the lack of planning, the monstrous, shapeless buildings put up only by foremen without architecture, and the potential in these chaotic streets for disorder. A decade later, the British began to understand what Schinkel had meant. The intervening years had seen the first outbreaks of cholera and some of the worst civil unrest in their history. At Bristol, the Bishop's Palace had been burned down by rioters, and Nottingham, the castle, had been destroyed. Pugin's message was simple. If there is something wrong with our cities, then there is something wrong with ourselves. And society and architecture both need reform. His prescription was a characteristic mixture of the romantic and the pragmatic, a proposal which at any other moment in history would have seemed fantastic, but one which caught the brittle mood of the mid-1830s. Contrasts argued for a revival of medieval Gothic architecture, and with it a return to the faith and the social structures of the Middle Ages. While the text begged as many questions as might be expected for such a thesis, the pictures were a persuasive exercise in graphic polemic. Each plate took a single urban building type and compared the modern example with its 15th century equivalent. Thus, a picture of a late Georgian inn cobbled together inconveniently from a row of terraced houses and set behind sharp iron railings, set next to one of the Angel Hotel in Grantham with its welcoming bow windows and promising beer cellar. London University, founded in the year that the book was released, was represented by King's College in the Strand. Its neoclassical gateway, squeezed between houses, looked mean beside the mighty front of Christ Church, Oxford. The drawings were all calculatedly unfair. King's was shown from an unflatteringly skewed angle, and Christ Church was edited to avoid showing its famous Tom Tower because that was by Christopher Wren and so not medieval. But the cumulative rhetorical force was tremendous. Pugin had struck at a moment when the architectural establishment was coming under critical scrutiny. The stucco floor-fronted neoclassicism of the Regency pilloried in contrast was looking tired. Increasingly, it seemed to represent an age of decadence and waste of public money. John Nash, its most eminent exponent, had died the year before in disgrace, having been unable to account for the huge overspend on Buckingham's Palace. A public inquiry had failed to establish the exact cost of George IV's lavish refurbishment of Windsor Castle. While Pugin was planning contrasts, this simmering resentment against a closed and self-serving architectural establishment came to a head late on one October afternoon in 1834 when the Palace of Westminster caught fire. The blaze turned out to be the last great show of Georgian London, watched by a vast crowd, which included Pugin and Turner, who painted it. As the Office of Works moved swiftly to bring in one of its architects for the rebuilding, public opinion rebelled. If there was to be a new seat of government, it should mark a new start for architecture as well as parliament. As the Morning Herald put it, this time the British people intend to have the choosing of the architects. The competition designs and the inevitable row that surrounded the final selection of Charles Barry's Gothic scheme was the context in which contrasts, the work by Pugin, emerged to popular acclaim. At the time, however, despite his claims for architectural omniscience, Pugin was little more than a draftsman. One of his more lucrative jobs had been to provide the decorative details for Barry's winning Westminster design, and he was to return to work on the palace from time to time for the rest of his life. Over the years, he designed some of its most successful elements, including the interior of the House of Lords. Now, however, the success of Pugin's manifesto launched him as an architect in his own right, and he set out about rebuilding Britain as a Gothic Catholic Christendom. It was a quixotic crusade, but one in which he came closer to success than might ever have been expected. By the time Pugin was 30, he had built 22 churches, 3 cathedrals, 3 convents, half a dozen houses, several schools, and the Cistercian monastery. He carried the battle into the heart of the industrial cities, the inexhaustible mines of bad taste at Birmingham and Sheffield, infested with Greek buildings, smoking chimneys, radicals, and dissenters. St. Chad's, his Birmingham church, built among the squalor of the gunmaker's quarter, became England's first cathedral since Wren's St. Paul's. At the laying of the foundation stone, Pugin announced that he would not rest until the cathedral bells drowned out the steam whistle and the proving of the gun barrels. Politically, he might best be described as a conservative radical. He wanted to reform society by returning it to a benign hierarchy, an idealized medievalism in which class could look upwards for support and would accept responsibility for those below them. It was the indifference of the modern city that appalled him. In 1841, he published a second edition of Contrasts to which he added two new plates that developed the argument beyond individual buildings to present a whole moral panorama. One showed contrasted cities, the other contrasted residences for the poor. In the first, the medieval city, with its graceful spires and safe defensive walls, set beside its modern equivalent, the walls broken down, the spires ruinous, and the horizon dominated by kilns and factories. Its point was simple enough, that we build most solidly in the areas of life in which we invest most of ourselves. The contrasted residences of the poor made a subtle case for the relationship between architecture and ideas. Here, Pugin compared the monastic foundation of the Middle Ages, where monks fed and clothed the needy, grew food in the gardens, and in the fullness of time gave the dead a decent burial, with the panopticon workhouse where the poor were beaten, half-starved, and sent off after death for dissection. Each structure was the built expression of a particular view of humanity. Christianity versus utilitarianism. Again, he hit home. The workhouses created under the new poor law troubled many Victorian consciences. To the rising generation of architects, these images acted as a call to arms. George Gilbert Scott remembered being awakened by Pugin to the possibility for architecture to deliver human dignity. 10 years later, at the Great Exhibition, Pugin was able to offer the public some answers to the questions that contrasts had raised. To furnish his buildings, he had designed a complete range of Gothic furnishings, sacred, secular, and domestic, and many of them available to order at relatively modest prices. Seen together in the Crystal Palace, his plain flat-pack tables, colorful dinner plates, and ceramic garden seats arranged beside stained glass and vestments held out a vision of the good life in the modern city, one that combined God with hearth and home and was deeply appealing to the mid-Victorian mind. The Great Exhibition, you remember the Crystal Palace by Joseph Paxton and so on, should have been Pugin's moment of triumph. But by the time it opened, he was fatally ill and disillusioned. He had been in some ways too influential for his own good. Imitators, many cheaper and all of them easier going, had poached much of his architectural practice. His work for Barry at Westminster had become a poorly paid treadmill. By a sad irony, the last design he ever made in January 1852 was destined to be his most famous. It was for the clock tower of the Palace of Westminster. Days later, he lapsed into psychosis and died in September aged 40. The clock tower, which everybody knows, remains his most prominent memorial, but his more important legacy is in the solid civic centers of Victorian towns, the urban churches, local schools, and middle-sized family houses built by the next 3 generations of architects who had been inspired by contrast to try and bring humanity and coherence to the city. Now, sorry about this rather long text. Now we'll go to my presentation. And he was indeed an inspiring presence in architecture. And it is my pleasure to say a few things about him. So Augustus Pugin, 1812-1852. So he was born 210 years earlier, and he died 170 years earlier. So Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, born, as you can see, on March 1st, 1812, was an English architect, designer, artist, and critic who is principally remembered for his pioneering role in the Gothic Revival style of architecture. His work culminated in designing the interior of the Palace of Westminster in Westminster, London, England, and its iconic clock tower, later renamed the Elizabeth Tower, which houses the bell known as Big Ben. Pugin designed many churches in England and some in Ireland and Australia. He was the son of Augustus Pugin and the father of Edward Welby Pugin and Peter Ball Pugin, who continued his architectural firm as Pugin and Pugin. He also created Alton Castle in Alton, Staffordshire. So here is a graphic work with him and the famous, clock on the famous tower. Let's read again. It's called the Big Ben. Romantic figure, fighting for bringing back God in our lives in a serious and exalted way. Here is a portrait of Pugin. Again, he died at 40, but by 40 he built many, many churches and cathedrals and schools and houses and so on. The true principles of pointed or Christian architecture. He was a medievalist living in the wrong century. And I don't know about his attempt to unite, spirit with utilitarianism. I don't think it's easily possible. He believed in it, but I'm not sure that it was possible when the Industrial Revolution kind of began to talk about God in a Gothic way. He tried an apology for the revival of Christian architecture, and here it is. He would have filled the whole town and the whole city with churches and churches and churches. Hopefully not corrupted churches. He was an exalted spirit. He believed in what he advocated. So here is a drawing by him, and I think it's a very nice pencil drawing, despite its not so excellent state that it was photographed in, but it's still, you can tell, a skillful drawing. He designed many things. He not just buildings, but also ornaments and furniture. We'll see some of his beautiful ornamental designs. He was a dreamer, of course, and unfortunately he died at 40 as a dreamer. The Neo-Gothic or the Gothic Revival in Great Britain was indeed a very powerful movement, and Victorian architecture is remarkable. So his influence on British architecture was significant, and I would say needs applauses from us, because it is in many cases quite remarkable. I'm not usually advocating the cause of any revivalism, but there was something about the Gothic revival in Great Britain which I think deserves appreciation. Now, was this him, or is this some kind of a representation of a humble anonymous worker building the cathedral? We need, well, it's probably difficult to recall, so to speak, that kind of exuberance in building the cathedral. But even Walter Gropius, in his short manifesto for the Bauhaus, was pointing in that direction. And in fact, the graphic representation of the manifesto by Walter Gropius represented nothing else than what they called, or Lionel Feininger, who designed it, who drew it, the Cathedral of Socialism. Well, the Cathedral of Socialism must have been a different cathedral than the so-called cathedral built by real-time so-called socialism that we experienced in the second half of the 20th century. Anyway, back to Pugin, where he loved to draw, and he didn't draw digitally, of course. Now, the Palace of Westminster in London, we all know it. He worked with Barry. He didn't work alone. He was rather you know, the second man there at most, but he influenced the aesthetics of this famous place in London significantly. The Scarisbrick Hall, designed by Pugin, and I mean, just this building. If an architect today would build just a building like this one, would feel rather accomplished. But he built many. I don't know if I remember correctly, but I think he built 40 churches and cathedrals. 40. And in less than 20 years, because he died at 40. So Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin, they did this most important work for London. And, you know, everybody knows it. So the exalted Gothicist did something very, very useful, even in the secular field, for London and for Great Britain, and actually for the world. This is just an introduction to Augustus Pugin. He deserves more study, and I'm sure, I hope by next year I will be able to amplify my presentation about him. Now, the Big Ben, which I mentioned already, it's the big clock on this famous tower in London. He probably collaborated with some craftsmen and even engineers, but the aesthetics of everything here belong to him. And I think they are appealing today as they were appealing at the time when it was built. The truth of the matter, this Gothic Revival architecture is not without charm. And it doesn't matter how so-called modern you are, this is an architecture which still impresses. And if it is monumental, it's also sensitive. So you see here what they did. Charles Barry did the action, but I think there were also, they collaborated. I understood that for more than 15 years, Pugin would work on and off on this project. Apparently, this belongs to him, at least this part of the tower. But he worked on the interior of this building and on many things. Anyway, he was part of the team. From what I read, actually, Charles Barry perhaps was not truly, very strong in terms of design. Pugin had an influence here, a significant influence, although he was young. Here are some, people, cleaning up it's giant, this clock, as you can see. It brought emotion to me, this picture, to realize that we'll see it like this, but look at the scale. Now, a Catholic Church. I only show a few works by Pugin in this presentation. Again, if an architect would build just this building and would feel accomplished, but he built around 40 just churches, besides many other kinds of buildings, and by 40, yes, by 40. Yes, from a modernistic point of view or position, maybe this architecture is a little bit passive, let's call it this so. But I think Gothic, a certain kind of Gothic revivalism or revival can be discerned in contemporary architecture in various places. You know, Calatrava, sometimes his structures have something so-called Gothic. Not the only one. There are other architects today who it seems this influence coming from before the Renaissance can be discerned even today, and I'm glad it can, because I think there are valuable inspirations and lessons coming from there. Another valuable inspiration coming from there is the new interest in the ornament. We had enough. I mean, enough is enough. An architecture without ornament is like a tree without leaves and flowers in the spring. It's exactly the same thing. And I understand Adolf Loos, I understand certain simplifications that were corrections actually that were needed at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. But we live now 100 years later, at least. Things changed. And ornament brings to a building, if it's genuine and heartfelt and sensitively done, it brings to a building exactly this sensitivity. Bare walls are bare walls. And okay, maybe this is too sweet, too literal for our taste today, I would understand. Still, ornament, if it's again heartfelt and genuine and skillfully done, is a good contribution to architecture. It doesn't have to be this way, because we don't believe any longer in narration. We don't believe any longer in, of course, this is a sacred building, but here there are, literal figurations that refer to the narration of the people, in this case, the person who is housed in this Domus Eterna. St. Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, designed by Augustus Pugin. So this is actually in Sydney, in Australia. But look at this building. Is it a bad building? I don't think so. Okay, it's not Chartres Cathedral, was not built in the 12th century, it was built in the 19th century, but I still think it has dignity and beauty, and as such, it deserves to be acknowledged and applauded. Designed two of our landmark properties, the Grange and in Surrey. This is, well, anyway, this text, I don't know what happened here. I'm a little bit embarrassed. I should have had some pictures and I don't. Look at this church. It's a country church. It's a rural church. But I actually salute even its modernity. And even if I said what I said about ornaments, this building doesn't have ornaments towards the outside. It's quite sculptural and in a modern way almost. It's vigorous. Inside, perhaps, the sensitivity of ornamental design is present, but towards the outside is quite, I would call it modernistic. And if it wasn't the texture or the tectonics of the materials he used, it would have been even more so. I like rural churches anywhere in the world, because I think those rural small churches are closer to the earth and are closer to that beginning which Louis Kahn thought is always in harmony with the human spirit, and it's closer to nature, as you can see. Another church, a smaller church, but still, even if here the innovation is not, obvious, I still think such buildings bring dignity to their communities and to the places they are in. who cares that the elements affected the building? Quite the opposite. I think the elements brought the passage of time to the building and gave it an additional quality, perhaps. Anyway, it's moving, and in the end, or as the saying goes, at the end of the day, what matters? This man built for God, and built significantly, and wrote about it and fought for it. He succeeded. I'm not so sure about, but he did succeed in Great Britain in the 19th century. But of course, the assault on spirit was massive and continues to be massive. A round tower attached to a church and home of this whatever. Again, it's a ruin, but for the spirit, as Cantacuzino would have said, referring to the columns of Persepolis, for the spirit is enough. What I see here warms my heart, and it's just a ruin. But and even if I didn't know the building was built by Pugin, I still would have liked it. Now, tiles designed by Pugin between 1845 and 1851. He died in 1852. Yes, they are not idiosyncratic. They believe in symmetry, in figuration. But I think even if you don't have a nostalgic state of mind, they're nice, to say the least. Maybe the word nice is too sweet and not adequate, and I apologize for it. How could we bring this kind of sensitivity into the present? I'm not very sure. But here was a spirit that lived in the 19th century, but had his inspiration somewhere else. Now, ornamental designs. Well, what was before was also in a way ornamental design. Here we see more of it. We see what is not taught in schools any longer. I mean, we impoverished architecture incredibly. We think architecture is just about space and white walls and glass. The more glass, the better. That's all. That's all that architecture is for us today. And it's not like this. I mean, here in the smallest detail, there is more richness than in a whole building built today. Architecture is not just about space, and it's not even about space, as Vito Acconci said, but he was not the only one. It's about time. Whatever Bruno Zevi might say. Now look here, these are just details and they are drawn. But no one could contest that there is something very interesting here, and rewarding for the eye and for the soul. Pugin's Gothic Ornament, the classic source book of decorative motifs by Augustus Charles Pugin. And the funny thing is that we can actually do such things very easily today with all the technological tools and gadgets we have at our disposal. They don't have to be so sweet. We can work differently, but again, the idea to bring back ornament, I don't think, and it's not just about the ornament as a graphic device. It's also about weaving, because Gottfried Semper was correct when he said that the first architectural gesture actually was weaving, and he connects this thought that he had with the deepest, with the oldest etymological root of the word architect, and that is teks, T-E-K-S, which in the Indo-European language meant to weave. to weave. And what is the relevance of weaving to architecture? Well, Godfrey Semper said it very simply. The first man on earth who built their first hut or the first building, they gathered around the fire, they returned from work, from hunting and fishing. They didn't have yet a home. They didn't have tools to cut down trees to create the structure. So they moved vegetable material from bushes, from trees, from whatever. They removed them by hand without tools, and they started to weave them. And thus they created the first panel, kind of a flexible wall, you know, from vegetable material that was done through weaving. And it's in the very word architect, the text present, because architecture, texture comes from texture, comes from text, which means to weave. And when you weave, just as someone weaves a sweater, ornament comes naturally into being. That's why most people who still weave or embroider something, they bring in ornament naturally. It comes natural to them. So there is a connection between weaving and ornament. I call this the feminization of architecture. And to weave, all the goddesses of weaving, and there were such goddesses in ancient mythology, were women. And there were such goddesses. And I know them by hand, by name. So text actually refers to weaving and refers to the feminine side of architecture, which unfortunately was neglected for too long, but it should come back. And Pugin was working in this direction. He was not the only one, of course, in the 19th century. Here is a series of 31 designs, floriated ornament by him. It's a book. He published many books. You know, again, they might seem to us cynical as we are, as too sweet, too nostalgic. You know, someone might call them gingerbread, for gingerbread houses. No, I would say these, yes, they have a sweetness about them, but they represent a different kind of sensibility. Of course, how could you do something like this when Mr. Putin is bombing at this very moment Ukraine with bombs, not to speak about the nuclear bombs? So indeed, how could you do something like this when on the sky there are criminal planes flying with deadly bombs ready to be deployed? So yes, this is a question, you know, but how could we fight the terrors of modernity with many problems unless we go back perhaps to forms of sensitivity which in their fragility could advocate a different spirit? Okay, these flowers are too literal and too explicit and too sweet, but maybe in their fragility flowers could defend us.